Harpers Ferry, West Virginia is one of the United States' most historically enriched communities. However, its advantages in water power and the industries the rivers energized would lead to the town's near destruction. In a future episode of Retracing History, we'll be exploring two key engagements that occurred around Harpers Ferry pertaining to the American Civil War. But in this installment, we shall explore the wider scope of history that transpired at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. From early visits by a founding father to the erection of one of the earliest black colleges in the United States, let us explore how Harpers Ferry's past was forged. What a perfect way to tell the story of Harpers Ferry, or at least start the story, is by explaining Jefferson Rock. So in 1783, Thomas Jefferson came out to view land in what was then northern Virginia. And he claimed to come find these rocks that were perfectly balanced, just a mere thin sandstone keeping it all in place. And from that rock wrote these lines. Since it has become a landmark associated with our third president. Now, interestingly, there's some local lore. So the local lore is, in 1799, during the Quasi-War, during that time, it almost looked like the United States was going to go to war with France, and they raised regular United States soldiers and everything, and then they didn't know what to do with them. So they came up with the idea, hey, you know that project where we're going to build an armory at Harpers Ferry since 1794? How about let's actually do that while we have the troops around for the manpower? So they sent them here for a few months, and they were camped actually on this hillside now called Camp Hill. It's now kind of the modern residential district of Harpers Ferry. Well, during the time of 1799, there was a lot of divide occurring in the United States government. The party systems were just starting to form, particularly between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Now, in 1799, Adams was president, but Jefferson, the vice president at the time, was starting to become very critical of Adams. And the story goes that one of the captains in the regular army here that was building the armory and arsenal, he was anti-Jefferson, couldn't stomach Jefferson. So, with nothing better to do, he ordered his company to come up to Jefferson Rock and dismantle it. And I think they actually ended up succeeding in knocking one of the boulders down on Shenandoah Street. Or again, that's how the local story goes. One of the soldiers that was in the army got word of this and was outraged. And he was a very staunch Jefferson supporter and actually challenged the captain to a duel. Now, army officials stepped in, cooler heads prevailed. Both men were court-martialed and basically both put in the dog pen as a result. Now, the rocks themselves have been relatively well preserved, although in some periods they were heavily covered in graffiti. Historical graffiti that's since been washed away by the sands of time. But in 1860, they put 4 pillars in there to hold the flat rock up so we can still see what Jefferson saw when he came up here in 1783. So it's a little hard to see, but this is the home of the namesake of Harpers Ferry, Robert Harper, an Englishman that came here to North America and found an interesting tract of land and saw an opportunity to run a literal ferry here. Now, when he arrived here, there was very few people living here. Any guesses on what they called this region before it was Harpers Ferry?
Ooh. No clue.
The Hole.
The Hole?
The Hole, because there is a hole in the mountains for the Potomac River.
Oh, that makes sense.
Now, the little that I've gathered, the landowner that owned this region, now we're talking 1740s, so this was still Virginia colony was here, British Empire. He was not popular with Lord Fairfax. Really did not like the landowner, so when Harper moved in here, I was like, yeah, I kind of just want to live in this region, but kind of work for the guy who owns this land. And Fairfax was like, do you want to buy the land? So even though another man owned this, Fairfax gave him the land grant because they liked Harper instead. Hence the name Harpers Ferry. Now, not many structures were built during Harper's life. This structure, which was built in 1775, he didn't really get to live in it too much. It's built on the site of his earlier home. He passed away in 1782, so he hardly ever got to live in it. And in fact, he had no children, so went to a relative of his in the Wagger family. And that's where you get the name of the Wagger House. It used to stand down there. It was a key part of the John Brown raid, 100 years after Harper settled this region. Things were quiet in the Hole until the approach of the 19th century. Descendants of settlers made bank when the federal government began buying property for a federal armory and arsenal. Although the country already had one established in Springfield, Massachusetts, Southern politicians argued for a second installation at Harpers Ferry for a multitude of reasons. The Potomac and Shenandoah rivers are sources of raw energy that could be tapped into to power machinery on a large scale. The Potomac River can provide a direct link between a federal cache of weapons and the nation's capital. The mountains which surround Harpers Ferry appear to make the confluence impregnable to attack. It's also important to consider the delicate balancing game Northern and Southern politicians were playing since the United States' inception. Though this would ultimately tear the country apart in 1860, a half-century earlier, it was an unwritten law followed by all. While official authorization was given in 1794, financial and manpower shortages delayed completion of the first arsenal buildings to 1801. The initial operations were crammed into irregular wooden and brick buildings clinging to both rivers. The workforce was small, about 100, and helmed by civilian managers, often with close affiliation with the townspeople. Each worker viewed themselves as a skilled gunsmith, every firearm produced as its own unique handcrafted item. One of the armory's first prominent inventions wasn't even a firearm.
So this skeletal structure, which caught our attention with the rope, is actually a representation of a collapsible boat that was designed for Meriwether Lewis. Yes, one of the two individuals of the famed Lewis and Clark expedition. Reason being, Meriwether Lewis came to Harpers Ferry in 1803 to procure supplies to go west. And this included, in addition to weapons that were being manufactured in Harpers Ferry, also trade items that they can give with the Native Americans as they move west. Well, he gets here and he's expecting the items to be ready, just easy to come pick them up. Turns out they've not been fully manufactured yet. So he was delayed for about a month in Harpers Ferry. And while he was here for a month, he took advantage and started working with the Army superintendent on designing a metal collapsible boat. Now, this boat was designed to withstand the forces of the Missouri River Falls, the Mississippi River Falls, and the Ohio River Falls, the treacherous waterways they're going to be navigating. So if they couldn't take the keel boats over, they can portage overland, but put all their supplies in this boat, which in theory would survive the falls, and then they'd pick it up down below. So Meriwether Lewis was proud of this design, called it his favorite boat, and it was great in theory. They tested it on the Potomac River, everything, but in execution, when they actually used it on the Missouri River, it proved not to be up to task, and he sadly had to abandon it during the expedition. So they've set up some interpretive plaques down there. This is part of the armory grounds, and you can probably see very faintly in the grass some of the foundations of the buildings that once were standing here.
The armory and arsenal's meager production would be put to the test with the onset of the War of 1812. During that conflict, nearly 30,000 firearms were shipped out of Harpers Ferry. Most were smooth-bore flintlocks. It was apparent to officials in Washington, D.C. that changes were needing to be made in the philosophy of firearm manufacturing. One step was taken with the arrival of John Hall in 1819, a Maine gunsmith who had received a federal patent for a breech-loading rifle with uniformed parts. While not the first to experiment with interchangeable components, it nevertheless was a turning point for all of America's Industrial Revolution. Hall would stay 2 decades in Harpers Ferry, overseeing the creation of 25,891 firearms based upon his patent. The federal government would allot $400,000 during that period to Hall's operations, a third of which was devoted exclusively to machinery. In order to streamline manufacturing, Hall helped develop a variety of equipment, all powered by an ingenious system of belts and pulleys that were originally employed in his shops along the Shenandoah River, but soon were incorporated through the entirety of the federal armory. Before his death in 1841, Hall had received orders from 96 different congressmen, the United States Marine Corps, 2 foreign governments, and a multitude of other private entities. This is representative of some of the machinery that was in the armory. In the back, you'll see a lathe to make a barrel. I believe that's 1830s period. I was going to sign above. Then forward here, we got a lathe to fashion out the stock for the firearm. That right there is a 2-spindle drill press from the 1830s, and that's what was used to drill out the holes in the lock plates. Although the machinery had been upgraded, the crews behind them had yet to adapt. The skilled laborers chafed against the shift toward industrialization, which welcomed unskilled workers so long as they could meet uniform schedules and deadlines. Corruption abounded in the management, as most in charge of the armory were quick to be close with Harpers Ferry's ruling class. Early efforts to bring the armory under federal control met with disaster. The murder of Superintendent Thomas Dunn by a disgruntled employee in January of 1830. So this is Whitehall Tavern. It's right across from the armory. And a little bit about, what was I going to say? A little bit about alcohol and the U.S. Armory. So you probably imagine that you shouldn't be drinking on the job. That being said, what I've read that the early 19th century, the rules are pretty lax, so much so they actually had buckets so the men could put whiskey in the shop while they were working. And then if you had like an army official, what they would do, they would lean out the window and drink the whiskey. So technically they're not drinking in the buildings.
Oh, that's great.
So a lot of superintendents that were with the locals, they were able to get away with that for a little while. But in 1841, they brought in the military system, which basically told all the civilian workers, you are working for the government, you're going to work like the government, and we're going to treat you like you're working for the government and the military. So no more whiskey drinking out the windows, and people kind of got a little upset, a little sour.
Understandable.
So later on, as an added bonus, because, well, if you weren't drinking on the job, you would just come to one of these taverns, the government decided to try to start buying out these common houses, and at least with the plaques that's down there in 56, the U.S. government bought this and then basically shaved a good several feet off when they were widening the armory grounds. So, no more booze.
No more booze.
No more booze. In 1841, Major Henry Craig arrived in Harpers Ferry to become the new superintendent and brought about sweeping reforms. Workers initially opposed these reforms and went all the way to the White House to air their grievances to President Tyler, but to no avail. Over the next decade, however, tensions between federal management and local population settled as most of the workers' housing was sold to the employees. This helped to finance the reconstruction and expansion of the Army and Arsenal buildings, allowing for production to reach a peak of 10,000 arms annually by mid-century, with the assistance of nearly 300 employees of various caliber of skill. The arrival of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, crossing the Potomac River at the confluence, achieved the direct artery the Founding Fathers had originally hoped. The industry that had taken generations to establish at Harpers Ferry would also lead to its destruction. First, in October of 1859, famed abolitionist John Brown led a band of raiders in an effort to capture the federal arsenal. The plan was to use the stand of arms housed on the armory grounds to arm runaway slaves and begin a slave revolt. Local militia and the United States Marine Corps stopped these plans. But this raid increased the polarization of the country, which escalated to full civil war. Then in April of 1861, pro-secession militia in Virginia attempted to capture the Army and Arsenal. The small Union garrison of 40 soldiers set fire to the buildings and destroyed as much of the machinery they could. Confederate forces nevertheless salvaged several pieces of equipment dumped into the rivers and shipped them south. Union and Confederate armies would exchange the town, vying for and destroying the remaining valuable infrastructure to avoid capture. So this is St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church, constructed on the height overlooking Harpers Ferry in 1833. Interesting story with the American Civil War, since during the battle in September of 1862, you had artillery emplacements on those heights. It was pretty bad. It was pretty bad to be down here. They put a British flag on top of the church to try to claim that they were supported by the British government and they could therefore not be fired upon. Seems to work because it's still standing here today. So these are the ruins of St. John's Episcopal Church.
one of 5 early churches put in Harpers Ferry. It was built 1852 with monies that the friars actually raised, and it served as a hospital and later barracks during the American Civil War. Now, the damage is not from the Civil War. It was fully rebuilt, but by 1895 they'd built a new Episcopal church farther into town, and well, I can understand that people didn't want to hike up here.
Yeah.
There's a photograph of the original church.
The American Civil War had destroyed the lives of Harpers Ferry's residents, industries, and infrastructure. It had also led to the emancipation of some 30,000 people from slavery in the Shenandoah River Valley, many of whom had never had a formal education. The Freedoms Bureau of the United States government, the Free Will Baptists of New England, and Maine businessman John Storer provided the funding necessary to purchase federal property in Harpers Ferry for a college devoted to African American students. Many of the initial teachers were missionaries that came from northern churches and used former armory structures on Camp Hill for classes and boarding. By the dawn of the 20th century, however, a full campus had been erected.
So this structure also built on what we now know as the Storer College campus. It was also built 1858 for the armory. It was for the paymaster's clerk, and didn't really get to see much use as that because the war was coming pretty close by that point. So it was likely occupied as well by Union and Confederate forces during the American Civil War. But after the war was over, as we mentioned, because part of Storer College, it's named after Reverend Alexander Morrill, so that's why it's known as the Morrill House. Came down from Maine and was to establish a missionary for Free Will Baptists. So he's one of the founders that established this college out here, and his family lived here while he was teaching here at Storer College for 20 years. Speaking of Morrill, here is the Reverend Morrill. His grave here, right behind this church. I wonder if this is actually the church he talked about. Well, I would say yes, because it is Curtis Free Will Baptist Church, or at least that was the congregation when he built it back in the 1890s.
Looks like he died in 80s.
So this might be one of the replacement churches.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
But I have a distinct suspicion this might have been a cemetery.
On the site, yeah.
Could have been a cemetery, and they exhumed everybody, but decided to keep Morrill due to it being his property.
Yeah, possibly.
So they got some trophies here from Storer College over the years. Mile Relay Cup, Field Day winner. Anybody ever won Field Day before in school?
Well, we were hosting. We didn't have field day.
I remember Field Day. I did nothing.
Although Storer College was a grand step toward extending the rights of the U.S. Constitution to African Americans, Jim Crow laws and voter disenfranchisement remained rampant across the country. A multitude of civil rights organizations formed by the 20th century but clashed over policymaking. Two schools of thought had developed, championed by Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, respectively. Washington and his Afro-American Council believed full equality would come gradually by demonstrated hard work to the public. Unsatisfied, Du Bois helped define the Niagara Movement in 1905, who advocated for the immediate dismantling of segregation policies. Their first meeting was moved to the Canadian side of the Niagara River for fear of attack. In search of a second meeting place, the movement knew it needed to find a United States venue to immediately send a message. In 1906, they met at Harpers Ferry due to Storer College and the history of John Brown's raid.
Yes, John Brown Day, or on August 17, 1906, the men and women of the Niagara Movement marched barefoot in a silent procession to the building known as the John Brown's Fort. That's the engine house where he held out during his raid. Frederick Douglass's son Lewis was there in honor of his father's special connection with Brown, and Henrietta Leary Evans recognized the life sacrifice of her brother, Lewis Leary, who was one of the raiders. And there's an illustration. The engine house was up on top of the heights west of town at that point.
Du Bois hoped the 1906 meeting would begin an annual tradition, but college officials were pressured by local authorities not to host such a civil rights event again. The Niagara Movement immediately lost steam, but several of its members would continue their fight against segregation, unifying with former members of the Afro-American Council to create the NAACP.
A long road of court battles and violent affairs would follow, but the NAACP reached a turning point with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. The Supreme Court decision declared segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional and is often considered one of the biggest civil rights victories in American history. Ironically, this also meant the end of nearly a century of education at Storer College. After the Civil War, Harpers Ferry survived on the transportation industry. Railroads followed the banks on both the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, meeting at the confluence and proceeding through Maryland Heights in a tunnel constructed in 1894 to bypass a sharp curve in town. There was also the C&O Canal, which passed town on the Maryland side of the Potomac River. Early efforts were made to establish Harpers Ferry as a tourist destination.
So at one time, the point where the two rivers meet here in Harpers Ferry was used as a amusement park by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which is something pretty common in the late 19th century during the Gilded Age. Railroads would build parks up to boost ridership, give people an excuse to buy a ticket. And this bandstand used to sit right at the point, but today it's up street and preserved here in the modern part of Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. Part of the reason Harpers Ferry is now a museum is because not a lot of people want to live in a floodplain. So while great in theory to put a rifle works alongside waterways for the water power, also comes with the drawback of lots and lots of flooding. Before people were residing in Harpers Ferry, they were already reporting, locals in the area were talking about how bad the flood was here. In fact, it was in 1748 what happened was called the Pumpkin Flood, because there was a harvest of pumpkins in the valley, so it all got washed down the river, so it was just pumpkins going down the flood. In 1996, there were actually not one, but two floods that same year that reached that height. So there were two different floods in 1996 alone. But the king of the floods is, of course, the 1936 flood, which we know from the Pittsburgh area as the St. Patrick's Day flood. Same general flood. One of the worst floods that ever hit the eastern seaboard.
Over time, residents of Harpers Ferry relocated to high ground west of the confluence. Nearly half of the pre-Civil War infrastructure of the town had been lost before the National Park Service stepped in. Originally focused on preserving the legacy of John Brown's raid, backlash in the 30s and 40s forced the Park Service to make a broader approach and designate the site Harpers Ferry National Monument. In 1963, a motion was carried in Congress to redesignate the park a historical park. In addition to preserving the surviving infrastructure, archaeology has been conducted where possible to rediscover layers of the town's past.
So they have this display here to show you the years of various structures that were built and are being still uncovered. So what you're seeing here is actually a basement for a building. But right here is actually a very narrow alley. Notice the brick. And we would be standing on the foundation of another structure, I believe. Oh, look at the piping.
Which might not be on
And when I say alleyway, I'm not talking like a full car alleyway. I'm talking about a covered alleyway between the two halves of the building.
There are three ways someone can access Harpers Ferry. The newest is by car via the often congested US Route 340, which if you want to watch myself and my friends suffer in traffic, keep your eyes peeled for our trip tapes. You can also access Harpers Ferry by rail on Amtrak's Capital Limited, but many stop in Harpers Ferry for it's considered the midway rest on both the C&O towpath and the famous Appalachian Trail. During our visit, hiker traffic exploring the historic grounds was high. No matter which mode of transportation you take, Harpers Ferry is a must-stop for any American, be it to explore history or simply to witness the majestic view that captivated Thomas Jefferson. If you enjoyed this dive into our shared past, let the algorithm know by hitting the like button. If you wish to be notified when the second half of this Harpers Ferry Deology premieres, be sure you are subscribed to Readout Productions. If you wish to go the extra mile supporting the channel, donations are accepted through the Ko-fi link in the description below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.